This is Tar Heel Talk, an in-depth look at the issues and people making news in North Carolina. Here's your host, Sonia Williams.
There is a little-known piece of U.S. history that originated right here in North Carolina. The 1898 Wilmington race riots marks the only violent overthrow of a government in the United States history. And now there is a film that documents this event entitled The Red Cape. Let's take a look.
The newspaper, gentlemen, has unlimited power in politics. Seems that our mulatto opponent, owner and editor of the Daily Record, Alexander Manley, has finally stepped neck deep into the mud puddle. I have been requested to present to you the White Declaration of Independence. The Committee of Colored Citizens is to address these resolutions by tomorrow morning. The time has passed for the intelligent citizens of the community to be ruled by the Negroes. But we are equally prepared now and immediately to enforce what we know to be our rights. To this declaration, we are irrevocably committed, and true men everywhere will hail it with a hearty amen. Negro domination shall henceforth be only a shameful memory to us and an everlasting warning to those who shall ever again seek to revive it.
And joining me now is the writer, director, and producer of The Red Cape, Nelson Oliver. And also joining us is Corey Greer Banks, 8th grade humanities instructor at the Explorers School in Raleigh. Such a powerful story, and one that has not been told a lot in North Carolina, surprisingly, and it happened here in North Carolina. Tell us a little bit more about the 1898 Wilmington race riots.
Well, in 1898, Wilmington, only 33 years after the abolishment of slavery, Wilmington had a highly prosperous black community. And they had, extreme economic influence, political influence. Some of the aldermen beneath the mayor were black to represent the black residents. And ultimately, the riot was crafted 6 to 12 months in advance by 9 affluent white men. They called themselves the Secret Nine, to disenfranchise the black community from the economics and politics of Wilmington. And they were, unfortunately, incredibly successful in that ambition.
And Corey, you have worked to teach history to our 8th grade students at the Explorers School in Raleigh. How have you helped to make this point in history relevant to our students today?
Well, and I teach 8th grade, and one of the we have to focus on American history in 8th grade. That is kind of our standards focus. And, we teach about the Civil War, and oftentimes in social studies we gloss over Reconstruction. Many people don't even realize the incredible success Reconstruction had in helping African Americans attain education and prominent professions and seeking political office. And, we know Jim Crow came, but we don't know how they swept away all of the success that was made in such a short amount of time during Reconstruction. And so I wanted to figure out how I can infuse that into my classroom. We teach integrated subjects, so we had to teach language arts and history within the same class. So I thought to myself, how can we achieve all of these things and make sure that they learn about this little known period in American history while they are in middle school.
Okay. And you also took your students down to Wilmington to actually walk through this time period.
So since we had to learn language arts standards while we were learning history, we decided to read a young adult novel that taught about Reconstruction, so we can hit kind of two birds with one stone, English standards and American history standards. And so we read this book called Crow, which is a fictionalized book told through the lens of an 11-year-old black child in Wilmington. And after we read this novel, the kids were so fired up. How could this happen? How could this happen? Even my colleague, who was born and raised in North Carolina, she didn't even know about this event. Right. And so the kids were so fired up and so incensed. They were really eager to see where this took place. So we had parent volunteers sign up. We did not have a bus. We did not. We had the kids pay $15 to help with gas to the parent drivers, and we got into our cars and we drove down to Wilmington and we walked the path of the novel and spent the day in Wilmington. We all gathered at the downtown library in Wilmington, and then we just started walking the path of the main character and the events that took place during the 1898 massacre.
Wow. And Nelson, you have worked to bring this film and this story to life through your work with videography. Tell us a little bit about your film.
Well, it actually began, my initial introduction to the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot began in the fall of my second year at UNCW. And a group of friends and I were walking along the Cape Fear River, and one of my friends who had grown up in New Bern, relatively close to Wilmington, had said, a small introduction about the riot, that there had been this highly prosperous black community that was disenfranchised by this white conspiracy. And I also grew up in North Carolina, native North Carolinian. My father was very steeped in history, and wherever we went in North Carolina, he would always provide us some, small anecdotes of, local history, that correlated to any given place. Right. And I tried to, I first asked him if he knew anything about the riot, and he didn't. And I then began, trying to research it on my own. And again, this was fall of 2005, and found that there really was not a lot of substantial factual information that had been compiled on the riot. And unbeknownst to me, Lorraine Umfleet had been working with the Wilmington Race Riot Commission, and they were compiling hundreds of pages of factual material, essentially creating like the initial factual document that became the Wilmington Race Riot Commission's final report, and that was released on May 31st of 2006. So once I learned that was released, I could not believe that I had never heard of this as a native North Carolinian, and that the event itself held national significance as the only violent overthrow of a government, the only coup d'etat in United States history. Wow. Yeah. And I, like you were saying about your students, it's like I felt equally outraged and that we weren't taught about this. And I just kept telling my friends what I was researching. I was like, you will not believe this happened and this happened. And I just felt compelled to do something about it, and that was really the beginning of the short film. I had, a lot of people ask me, why didn't I do a documentary? And I ultimately remember my sophomore year in high school, we were learning about the Holocaust, and we were reading Night by Elie Wiesel, and my English teacher put on one scene from Schindler's List, and that was the liquidation of the ghetto. And I felt the entire emotion of the room absorbed in that time period. I felt like we were all transported from our classroom in 2002 to 1942. And some of my classmates began crying, and one of them even said, I can't even watch this anymore. I have to go to the library. Right. And that is what motivated me to try and create an experience in history with the Red Cape, was to create an educationally informative experience that was emotionally engaging.
Right.
And I agree with you. I see that in the classroom. I've taught Reconstruction before. I've taught about the Civil War. I've taught Jim Crow just as a series of events and things that have happened. But never have I seen it come to life, and never have I seen the students get so emotional about it until they read a novel where it kind of told a story and they were able to put it in context. So now that there's a novel, a young adult novel, and a film, that is kind of just the icing on the cake.
Absolutely. We're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute. We'll be back with more on the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot after these messages. Today's show focuses on the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot and a new film that documents this event entitled The Red Cape. With us again is the writer, director, and producer of The Red Cape, Nelson Oliver. Also joining us is Lorraine Sykes-Umfleet, acting director with the Division of Education and Outreach for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Thank you both so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Lorraine, you have done a number of years worth of research on the 1898 Wilmington Race Riots. Talk a little bit about your work and your research and the events leading up to this major event in our history.
So the community in Wilmington came together in 1998 to acknowledge the centennial of the violence and the horrible things that happened in Wilmington. And growing out of that was an urge to really learn exactly what happened, because as we've heard, nobody really knew what the cause and effects of the violence in Wilmington were. So I began researching and writing. It was 3 years of solid research and writing. And I wasn't a conspiracy theorist prior to that, but by the time I was finished, I was. Okay. And I learned quite a bit about this unknown period in our state's history. It sort of gets swept over when you jump from the Civil War to World War I and World War II when you're studying North Carolina history. So it was really interesting to study this time period in history and put it to paper and really get at the internal politics, because this is what happened in Wilmington. Politics turned into bullets in the streets. And understanding how that happens and what rhetoric can do and how you can inflame a populace to kill their neighbors is something that's really scary but needs to be understood.
And you brought along some photographs, and we want to look at those, but I want you to also kind of tell us what exactly happened, because again, this is a very little known event in our history, but it's a very important event in our history. So kind of talk us through what exactly happened.
So it was a part of a political campaign in 1898. Beginning in August of 1898, there was an effort to push the white supremacy platform and to explain to the white voting population that they needed to do everything they could to support the Democratic Party agenda. And so this first image is a political cartoon that was in the News and Observer here in Raleigh.
Wow.
And this is one of the first times that political cartoons were being used as part of a campaign. And you may not be able to read and write in 1898, but you can look at that cartoon and you can understand what is being conveyed, that the white man is being stepped on by the black man, the Negro, and that white men need to do everything possible to keep the Negro out of their houses, out of their politics, and away from their women. This is Charles Brantley Aycock. Aycock was the chair of the state Democratic Party at the time, and we have to understand that Democrats and Republicans of 1898 are not Democrats and Republicans of 2016, 2017, 2018. So I have to be, really cognizant of when we explain what happened to the political parties. The Democratic Party of 1898 was the party of white supremacy and conservatives. And the Republican Party of 1898 was the party of Lincoln, progressives, and African Americans.
Okay.
So part of the campaign of 1898 was to remove the upper leadership in the African American community in Wilmington. And this image is of men who were arrested during the violence on November 10th and imprisoned overnight, and then marched to the train station the next day and told never to come back. And they meant it. And so this is those men being marched out of town.
So they had to leave Wilmington.
Had to leave Wilmington. And one man tried to come back, and he was met by a lynch mob and wasn't allowed to come back. This is John C. Dancy. He was an African American businessman in Wilmington. He was the customs collector for the port, And he was a federal employee, and he was protected during the violence because the men who planned the overthrow and all the violence knew that if federal employees like Dancy were affected, they would have potentially faced the federal government coming into Wilmington. This is one of the scariest things that I found through my research, and this is a group of men who are manning a machine gun on the back of a wagon. And this machine gun was taken through the streets of Wilmington to intimidate African Americans and to rally white men who were part of the riot. The gun was purchased by businessmen from the city, and it was taken out into the river on a boat with leading African American community people, and they shot the gun into the trees across the river to show the African American community what that gun would do if it was pointed at you.
Wow.
Very scary.
Yes. This is an image of Alex Manly. This oral tradition says this is Alex Manly. We're not quite sure, but Alex Manly was an African American newspaper editor in Wilmington, and he became a target of the white supremacy campaign of 1898, and he fled the city. And this is apparently an image of him fleeing right at that same time. The White Government Union was an organization that was developed by the Democratic Party to do a little bit more pressure on Democratic voters, physically intimidating white voters to make sure they voted for the white candidates, and to intimidate African American voters to keep them away from the polls on the day. Now, Wilmington was the largest city in the state. It had about 20,000 residents, about half African American and white, and one of the main industry drivers was tar pitch and turpentine. And this is an image of the city from the opposite wharf where naval stores were being stacked.
And it's important to point out that this was a prominent African American community that was targeted, and something that is almost unheard of in 1898.
Well, Wilmington was what the New South after Reconstruction could be. If you were an African American worker in Wilmington, regardless of your status prior to the Civil War and freedom, you were making it. And African American day laborers made more money in Wilmington than they did anywhere else in the state. Home ownership was higher in Wilmington among African Americans. Education levels were higher. Everyone, regardless of race and of education level, was making it in Wilmington. And 1898 and the white supremacy campaign put a dead stop to all of that progress for everyone for a period of time.
And Nelson, how does your film, The Red Cape, work to bring this experience to life for our viewers?
Well, going off of the historical photographs that were just shown, everything, even in terms of the look of the film was shot on 35 millimeter black and white film, and we really did work to bring that aesthetic to the screen, but even more importantly, communicating the broader before and after effects, the cause and effects of the riot, were really the most critical in terms of communicating that, especially for educational purposes as well as the experiential purposes. But we really focalize a large part of the story through the eyes of a 6-year-old child who is a fictional character interacting with historical characters and historical moments that actually occurred. You could liken it to Jack and Rose interacting with actual historical characters and historical moments on the Titanic. They are fictional characters interacting with actual history. So we really use the perspective of this character, Willie, this 6-year-old child who does not really understand this overarching socio-political conflict that he's involved in. But in the same way that those fictional characters in Titanic were used to communicate the broader tragedy of that event, the forced separation of loved ones amidst disaster, that's exactly what Willie communicates through 1898, which is the true tragedy being the removal of a future of, it's like someone who has all of this promise and prosperity right at their fingertips as a 6-year-old child, only to live the remainder of their life in a world of segregation, hatred, and intolerance.
Right. Absolutely. We're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute. We'll be back with more Tar Heel Talk after these messages. Welcome back to Tar Heel Talk. I'm Sonia Williams. There is a little-known piece of U.S. history that originated right here in North Carolina. The 1898 Wilmington race riots marks the only violent overthrow of a government in the United States history. And now there's a film that documents this entitled The Red Cape. And with us again is the writer, director, and producer of The Red Cape, Nelson Oliver, and also Corey Greer Banks, 8th grade humanities instructor at the Explorers School in Raleigh. Thank you both again for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, you have partnered together to help bring this film to our students, our 8th grade students, and help them to learn about this little-known history fact here in North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the partnership and how that all came about.
It was really so accidental. So we had finished up Crow in the fall. We went to Wilmington. We had a wonderful tour, a wonderful day, and we thought that would be our culminating event. And then in the Wilmington Star News, one of my colleagues, Shannon Hardy, she read it, or someone emailed it to her because she knew we had went on a field trip, and this was around St. Patrick's Day. And she texted to me, she said, "Oh, there's a screening for a new movie coming out. Maybe we can take our kids." And I'm like, "But we read that in the fall, you know, 8th grade kids. You know, that's too far gone." But then I saw the trailer and I was like, wow, this is kind of perfect for our kids to see. But I knew that we weren't able to get out to Wilmington again. And so I was like, well, I'll email the director. Maybe there's a screening in Raleigh. And this was on St. Patrick's Day. And he emailed me back, and he couldn't have been nicer. And he offered an educator's license. And I thought, okay, that would be good to just show my students in my classroom. And then we talked on the phone later, and he said I can open up the seats. We were able to reserve the North Carolina Museum of History and host a screening, and we've partnered with other schools who are going to come down to the viewing, and we have filled up 300 seats.
That's incredible.
That's going to see this film and be educated on the events in Wilmington.
And what a great way to have your film shown and also to reach an audience who knew nothing about this event in our history.
Absolutely. And I really, like myself and the cast and crew, we all maintained from the time we started filming, March 1st of 2008, we always maintained that we wanted this to be educationally informative. And that was really our goal from start to finish. And so I really couldn't be more thankful to Corey for helping set this up and, to share it with her students. The entire education plan that she's developed around 1898, I think is truly wonderful.
And I wouldn't have been able to do that without Lorraine and the commission and their work around this. The lesson plans, the activities are all available on North Carolina's Civics and Education Consortium site to make it easy for teachers, because let's be honest, teachers don't have a lot of time to just create things out of thin air. And due to Lorraine's efforts, the novel was able to be written. Teachers' lesson plans were able to be created, and now this film is available to us. So I think we're supposed to be teaching it to our kids.
Absolutely, and what a wonderful resource to have. How can people find out more information about your film and maybe possibly connect with you for future screenings?
Yes, people can learn more about the film, and they can email us directly using our website, which is www.theredcapemovie.com. And you can also communicate with us directly at facebook.com/redcapemovie.
Right. Well, you're doing great work, and we thank you so much for documenting this important time in history, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's Tar Heel Talk. To comment on this or other episodes of the show, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or send us an email to tarheeltalk@fox50.com. I'm Sonia Williams. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.